Lake Sturgeon, the living dinosaurs of the fish world. They are remnants of an ancient and primitive group of native species to the Great Lakes and surrounding areas. The Ojibwe call them the king of fish. So what happened in a 40-year time span that made the king disappear? This is the story of Lake Sturgeon and the Red River of the North.
When we think about lake sturgeon, they've been around as a species for over 150 million years. And when we compare that to something like a dinosaur we're all familiar with, Tyrannosaurus rex, well, they were around only about 65 to 68 million years ago. So we're dealing with a creature that's over twice as old as a dinosaur we're all familiar with. And yet, in the Red River Basin, through a combination of fragmenting the habitat and then overfishing that fragmented habitat, humans were able to drive that species to local extinction in just 40 years, between the years of 1880 and 1920. As folks settled this part of the world, we needed mill power. And that was for a variety of things, whether it would be the electric plants, whether it would be physical mills. We used it to power sawmills, grist mills, all sorts of things. But we required hydropower for development. So in a lot of places, the rapids were the mill site. So we're here today at one of the more historic sites in the Red River Basin, and the reason we're here is to talk about not only the history of this site and development, but also the history of the lake sturgeon and how this human history in the region interacts with the fish. So we're dealing with a fish that has a very long history in North America. And as part of that history, they have a very slow reproductive life cycle that requires them to undertake migrations to very specific spring spawning habitat. And that was all well and good for literally millennia. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, water power is what powered a lot of our communities, a lot of our local industry, and a lot of that industry took the form of the historic mill behind me. This has been here in one form or another since 1889 at this site. But when we did that, sturgeon, which had been native to this area, no longer were able to move up and down the river because they literally ran into a wall. And that wall not only eliminates the critical spawning habitat that's now impounded upstream of this site, we also lose the ability to get to that spawning habitat and others like it upstream. So you can see how this is really devastating to migratory fish, sturgeon in particular, but also including things like our native sucker species, walleyes, sauger. Anything that's a larger species that lives in a river system is going to move and be affected by a structure like this.
I think the term tourniquet applied to a dam on a river system applies to the fact that most riverine species utilize the river as an entire system. They tend to go and spend the fall and winter seasons in the lower part of the river system where the water's deeper, and that's where they winter. In the spring, just about every river species there is migrates upstream into tributaries where they find the suitable spawning gravels for laying their eggs. When you put a dam in place, those fish can't ascend or move up those rivers to get to those key spawning areas. So in essence, they serve as a tourniquet. There was dozens and dozens of dams on all the tributaries, the primary tributaries, the Ottertail River, the Pelican River, the Red Lake River, Wild Rice River. These were the primary tributaries that the historical information suggested the sturgeon would move up out of the Red River and spawn in those tributaries. So one by one, we started working with our partners on the removal or modification of those dams beginning in the mid-1990s.
Nobody had done a lot of this kind of thing, especially in terms of dam removal. Anything new, we didn't have really the case examples back then to share. So there was a bit of leap of faith, both on our own part that we could do a good job and on the public's part in that we had a reasonable chance of being successful with our logic.
At this particular site, the city of Crookston had a dam, and like many dams in the Red River Basin and around greater Minnesota, it was a low-head dam. And those are dams that discharge water over the top, and as that water falls, it creates a recirculating current. This is why low-head dams are often called the drowning machine dam, because they're extremely dangerous to the public.
Numerous drownings have occurred below the low-head dams in the Red River Basin. So interestingly, the municipalities also got behind the removal and modification of the dams. These dams also created maintenance headaches for all the people that owned those dams. There was high costs associated with fixing the dams after floods.
It becomes both more attractive for public use, as well as providing the natural resource benefit that was lost when the original dam was constructed.
So bringing that connectivity back and allowing fish to migrate up and down as they need to do was really the important goal of the project.
We have a loss of habitat, we have a loss of connectivity and a loss of migrations, and then on top of that, a commercial fishery developed. The caviar industry came to this part of the world, and Lake Sturgeon were seen as a source of a commercial product there. We began selling them for fuel for steamboats because the species is so oily. Some people were selling the meat, and others were selling the skin as a very durable leather. Perhaps the most interesting and valuable product, exceeding the caviar value of the sturgeon, was a substance called isinglass. Isinglass can be distilled from the swim bladder of a lake sturgeon and is an extremely high quality natural gelatin that was useful in high-end paints, women's cosmetics, particularly nail polishes, and it's also extraordinarily useful in the brewing industry. Most people who are familiar with American macro brews will note that those are very clear when you pour them into a glass. Well, isinglass is an extremely useful clarifying agent used by the brewing industry to achieve that clarity, and therefore we wanted a lot of isinglass for a lot of different purposes. So between 1880 and 1920, the commercial fishery developed in the Red River Basin. In the year 1900, it peaked with 1 million pounds taken in 1 year out of Lake Winnipeg. And then by 1920, the sturgeon were what we would refer to as commercially extinct. There was no reason to fish for them anymore because profit yield versus how much you invested in that just wasn't there. And then by about 1930, we recorded the last individuals from the Red Basin being taken by private citizens. So behind me is a former dam site, and within the Red River Basin, there are 78 major fish barriers. These are barriers that prevent fish from moving about the system and getting where they need to go. And at over 40 of those sites, we've completed projects like this one.
One dam didn't solve the problem. We had to do it piece by piece, and now we have species that hadn't been there since the dam construction began that have reestablished themselves in these watersheds.
We've recreated some of that riffle or rapid habitat, and that's a natural egg incubator for fish reproduction. That faster water moves silt out of those rocks. It also oxygenates the water as it tumbles through. So when our fish that like to spawn on this type of substrate use this, it's naturally clean and oxygenated for them.
The basic design of the Rock Arch Rapids was something I came up with about 27 years ago, I think now. It stemmed from microhabitat work we were doing with large fish like Lake Sturgeon in assessing the kind of habitats they sought out, which in the case of Lake Sturgeon was a very rare kind of habitat.
It's also intended to benefit some of our smaller bodied native fishes. In the middle of the river, we carry deeper, faster current, and then as we move out to the edge, it gets progressively shallower and progressively slower.
For migrating fish, that's really important because they can swim fast for a short distance. So they can burst through the gaps in the boulders where you can see the velocities are higher. They can burst really fast for a second or two. And then they can just chill in the pools and rest, and then as they work their way up. And when we remove the dam and see those fish come back, that validates our suspicions that the dam is in fact the cause of their decreased range.
Over my shoulder here, you can see them notching Drayton Dam. And that's really exciting for us at the DNR because this is the last low-head dam on the Red River of the North. So once this project is complete, the Red River will be completely unobstructed for fish and other aquatic movement from its beginning near Breckenridge, Minnesota, all the way to the Canadian border. This is also a huge step forward for our Lake Sturgeon reintroduction program. Currently, any lake sturgeon that move downstream of this barrier become stuck there for most of the year. They're unable to complete spawning migrations to and from overwintering habitat, and this will fix that problem. Now, when we modify dams, we're also helping the rest of the fishery recover from that fragmentation as well.
In rapids like this that we've built, we've had all different species spawn, from walleyes and lake sturgeon down to small minnows and darters and many other native species.
Now that's good news for our anglers, but it's also good news for the overall ecology of the river. So a project like this, while helpful for restoring lake sturgeon, also restores native sport fish populations.
I think that's got to be the goal of many of these watersheds, to reconnect them so they function in a way that's conducive to native species.
As more projects began to reconnect the Red River system, the process of reintroducing lake sturgeon populations began as well.
So right now we're conducting an egg take operation here for lake sturgeon out of the Rainy River. It took a lot of planning from the staff in the Baudette office to identify a location and also capture the fish.
So we set various size gill nets short term so that we're not stressing out the fish too much, and then we go lift them after a couple hours and take the fish, put them in a holding tank. For this process, we transferred them over to our partners with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who took them up and they complete their egg take.
For a long time, we've actually been obtaining our eggs from Rainy River First Nations, and we'd go purchase the eggs from them, rear them or stock them immediately here in Minnesota waters. Some of these fish will be reared to fingerling stage and then stocked. Other ones will be hatched out and stocked as fry. But these fish are going to be going all throughout the Red River Basin to various tributaries and lakes within the system. So it's part of our overarching plan.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff seen here are extracting milt from a male sturgeon, one of around 20 males gathered for the egg take. Next, scientists check the concentration and motility of the sample under a microscope. Then, when the females are ripened, eggs are stripped into a bowl. Then they are combined with the milt and stirred together. A clay mixture is added and a feather is used to prevent sticking. Now that the eggs are fertilized, staff work quickly to return the sturgeon to the water.
They're released unharmed, and generally they'll release with a portion of their ovaries still inside the fish, and they'll go and lay the eggs beyond what the eggs we take. So we're actually returning them to the population so that they can lay the rest of their eggs within that population.
From there, we took the eggs to Valley City National Fish Hatchery in North Dakota, and then we raised those lake sturgeon up, and then we eventually stock them out.
And they'll stay in our hatchery till usually around early October, and they're really fast growers. They try to outgrow the predators that eat them out in the wild. So they'll be anywhere from 6 to 8 inches long, and once they get to be about 6 to 8 inches long, we consider them bulletproof. There's not very many things that can affect their survival. These fall fingerlings can survive up to 60 to 80% in the locations where we stock them, so kind of a fascinating fish to raise.
We're here in Crookston, Minnesota today, stocking lake sturgeon in the Red Lake River. We're stocking in the Red Lake River specifically because this used to be one of the strongholds of lake sturgeon in the overall Red River Basin. We have historical records of lake sturgeon spawning in this river in the year 1800. And part of the reason we chose this particular site is both to try and reestablish some homing instinct in those juvenile lake sturgeon that we're stocking, as well as restoring the species to this specific portion of its range within the greater basin.
The fertilized eggs grew over the summer at the Valley City National Fish Hatchery in North Dakota. After a long drive, the fingerlings now await their new home within the Red River Basin. They're scooped up out of this specialized fisheries truck and placed in a shallow spot in the river. The natural camouflage of the fingerlings will help protect them from the perils of the river.
So today we stocked out 1,550 fish. Every fish got a pit tag and a scoot removed, and the pit tag is a 13-digit code that will stay with that fish for the rest of its life. And so when they catch these fish later on, when they're out doing field work, they can actually tell whether or not that fish came from the hatchery, and it gives them all sorts of great metrics to measure. So they can look at growth rates, they can look at where these fish are moving to, how they're utilizing the river, and why they're doing good or why they're not doing so good.
We do all these different netting and tagging programs on Lake Sturgeon since the late 80s, early 90s. And from that, we've developed a lake sturgeon management plan with short and long-term goals based on a bunch of different metrics such as size, age, and relative abundance.
We have a very robust tagging program, so we're able to identify spawning locations, spawning periodicity, or how often they're spawning. A lot of very important information to the future management of the species. So the long-term goal of this project is actually to have a sustainable and naturally reproducing population. And we've actually documented in 2022, we actually on video captured lake sturgeon spawning in one of the tributaries to the Red River. So we're actually starting to see some of the successes of this long-term project.
Now that's really notable because that's the first spawning event that we've recorded in over 100 years in the Red River of the North Basin. So essentially, the 2022 and 2023 spawning event starts the clock on the potential for the first naturally produced, not stocked, year class of sturgeon in the Red River Basin. Until we reestablish that natural reproductive cycle that's not stocking augmented, the population won't be considered fully recovered. In the case of a female lake sturgeon, when she is almost mature, she will undertake movements to a spawning location, and if the flow conditions are just right, if the temperature is just right, and if the habitat is just right, then maybe she will accelerate maturity and she will spawn. And if those needs are not met, she will choose not to spawn. She will reabsorb her eggs. So that's why when we began this reintroduction program, not only could we stock these fish, we had to make sure they had access to these habitats. Otherwise, there was no chance for a recovery because those females simply wouldn't have the resources necessary to trigger a reproductive event.
They're about starting to be of spawning age, the females. So we're approaching some of our long-range goals for the population here.
Does it feel good to know you're kind of bringing them back into their historic areas there?
Yep. The efforts here are going to leave a legacy for our future generations.
Babies that are born this year, in all likelihood, will have the right to vote, will have gone to college, and will be entering the workforce around the same time that fish produced this year will be hitting sexual maturity.
Now in late spring, the cold water has finally reached about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Fishery staff have been documenting the sturgeon starting to stack up in areas where they haven't had access to in generations. They are looking for a suitable spot to spawn.
On the Ottertail River here, you can see a concentration of sturgeon that are in the process of spawning. The females are closer to the bottom, the males are swimming around. The idea is for the males to bump and nudge the females so that they can release their eggs. They'll release the sperm at the same time. The current of the river here, the outlet, will let the eggs drift downstream. They'll settle in the rock crevices and be there until they hatch. Please make sure that you don't disturb the spawning fish. They'll be there only a short period of time doing what they do, and enjoy what they do, because it is an experience that you can't see all over. The original intent of the Arch Rapids is for fish passage, and a secondary benefit is to provide spawning habitat. And not only lake sturgeon, but walleyes, suckers, any bottom spawning fish can actually use these areas to spawn. So it's a beneficial project for a lot of different species.
Lake sturgeon recovery in the Lake of the Woods and Rainy River systems have faced similar challenges as their counterparts in the Red River of the North. In both size and numbers over the past few decades, thanks to the recovery efforts from DNR and its partners.
The first thing we need to think about is that it's been a massive team effort. Minnesota DNR has worked hand in hand with Red Lake DNR, as well as White Earth and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and all four of these agencies are responsible for raising and stocking lake sturgeon across greater Minnesota.
So much so that there is now recreational fishing opportunities for sturgeon. During the designated season, anglers can fish for sturgeon as catch and release, and some can keep a single lake sturgeon per calendar year between 45 and 50 inches or over 75 inches.
In a typical year, we'll see anywhere from around 200 to 300 fish harvested, and that's been within our management goals.
The chance to land a lake sturgeon has grown in popularity in recent years.
People really appreciate the idea that they're catching a fish that, in some cases it might be older than they are. In the future, as the fishery recovers, the system may very well be able to take more harvest. Now, some of our most popular times of the open water season actually happen when walleyes are closed and lake sturgeon are the only thing people can be fishing for. And the other part of it is it's something people can do with their family. You don't have to be able to, use complex fishing rods or lures or techniques. It's pretty straightforward. Put a worm on your hook and get it down on the bottom, and you'll get a chance at them.
To catch a larger fish, they got to go to an ocean setting. And here we got a very sporty fish that does a lot of that stuff like the ocean fish do. They jump, they get over 100 pounds.
Whether you're the one catching them or there's someone in your boat, it's a lot of fun, or even if it's the next boat over, just watching people catch them is a lot of fun.
Generally speaking, inlets to lakes are going to be good locations to at least start your search for lake sturgeon. Some of the neck down areas between basins that have current.
That's a big fish. That is a huge fish.
During the winter months, we do hear of reports of anglers catching lake sturgeon while they're pursuing other fish like walleyes and perch. It's getting to the point now where when they get one that bites, they know it's a lake sturgeon and they know what they're up against.
That is a giant, man.
The Red River and its tributaries aren't quite there in their recovery stages to allow a sturgeon harvest tag.
So Lake Sturgeon harvest right now is closed. An opportunity might rise in the future once we know that natural reproduction is able to keep the population going without stocking. Right now we're seeing real good natural reproduction the last couple years, and so we need to validate that the eggs are surviving, the fry are surviving, and those fish are reaching yearling stage. Ideally, we want to see the little sturgeon that are naturally produced actually probably get to maturity, and that's going to be the sure sign of a successful reintroduction program.
It's very seldom that you actually work with a species of fish in fish and wildlife management where you are making a change that can affect people's experiences with the river and fishing opportunities 50, 60, 70 years down the road. When we stock walleyes, you put some fry in, and in 3 years, 4 years, if you're successful, you have really good fishing. When you stock sturgeon, you're talking 25 to 30 years before people start really starting to enjoy fish that are approaching 50 inches in length or 30 pounds. So it's an opportunity for us in fisheries to work on something that's truly long-term, not short-term.
We like to call Lake Sturgeon our legacy fish because we're passing something along to the next generations, hopefully not just the following generation, but for generations to come.
Working on something positive really builds relationships.
It would not be able to take place without the joint efforts of Minnesota DNR, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Red Lake DNR, the White Earth Band, and Rainy River First Nations at Manitou Rapids. We have been working in conjunction with the state of South Dakota and North Dakota, and so when we're managing these fish, you can see that it's an extremely long-term process involving multiple generations of biologists from inception of the program through initial successes where we are now, up through hopefully final success and the ability to say that this population has recovered from its basin-wide extinction. And of course, nothing like this can succeed without funding. Whether that would be the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, the Reinvest in Minnesota program, or the Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Council, which is part of the Legacy Amendment that Minnesotans voted for in 2008, those funds have all been critical pieces of putting this sort of work on the ground at the state level. On the federal level, we've used National Fish Passage Partnership funds, as well as more recently, some of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation funding. So as you travel around the Red River Basin, you'll see this sign next to a lot of our projects. And that means this was funded, at least in part, by the Legacy Amendment, which was voted on by Minnesota citizens in 2008, specifically to fund this type of conservation activity. Without this funding, quite frankly, this work just doesn't happen. Sturgeons as a group worldwide are generally an imperiled species. Whether we're dealing with lake sturgeon in the Great Lakes states, shovel-nosed sturgeon and pallid sturgeon in the Missouri and Mississippi River drainages, or if we're dealing with some of the coastal species on the eastern and western seaboards. Sturgeon are something biologists are constantly engaged in researching and managing because the echoes of today's decisions will undoubtedly be heard 50 years down the road by other managers and the anglers and the public who finds these fish interesting and valuable.